Hi everyone, and welcome back to Cloudberry Flowers Farm and Garden. It's great to have you along with us. If you're a new subscriber from over the festive season, welcome. It's great to have you here. And if you've been following along for the last 12 months, it's great to have you back. I hope you're going to enjoy following along in the next 12 months and seeing what flowers we're going to grow. It's been fantastic over the last year learning from you as well, hearing about your own gardens, your own flower farms. That has been the best bit about doing the YouTube channel, is just getting to chat to you from all over the world. It's fantastic. We've all got different climates, different flowers that we grow, and it's great sharing experiences. January, as well as getting out in the flower patch, is also a lot of planning behind the scenes. So inside I will be thinking about what seeds and plants I want to grow this coming year. And the first place to start is by having a look back at 2021 and seeing which flowers grew really well for me, which were the ones that my customers really liked and were buying, which lasted a long time in a vase, and which were the ones that didn't do so well. Maybe they were affected by pests and diseases in the garden, maybe the weather just wasn't good in Scotland for growing these kind of flowers, or maybe they didn't last long as a cut flower. So that's the focus of this week's video. We're going to be having a look back at last year, lots of pretty pictures of flowers to show you, and we're going to chat about what were my successes and what were my failures, and from that I can make a plan for this year. Then next week we will be back in the flower patch and we'll be having a look at how things are getting on. So the hardy annuals that we sowed back in August and September, how are they doing? How about our sweet peas? Have they survived over the Christmas festive period? Do I need to be doing any potting on? And what seeds should I be starting to think about sowing just now? So I hope you enjoy having a look back at last year with me today. So going all the way back to March last year, it was very chilly. We were still having some restrictions from coronavirus, and I was having wedding cancellations because people just weren't sure whether or not their weddings would be able to go ahead later in the year. Out in the garden, the hellebores were doing really well. They don't mind the cold weather, so they were starting to flower and look really pretty. What I was having a huge problem with in the garden was the pigeons. They were eating all the Hesperus and Honesty fresh new leaves that were coming up and starting to grow, and really badly damaging this crop of much needed flowers which would come into bloom in May. What I've learned from this is that I really need to go out and I need to put netting over these areas of plants in the garden, and I've already been out this January to do that because I can see that the pigeons are back and they are doing the same thing again this year. Because the weather was so cold outside, there wasn't much flowering in the garden in March last year, but I did have crates of early flowering narcissi which I had forced in the greenhouse. You can see some here, and here are some snow baby in the greenhouse that were coming into bloom in March as well. So with the weather being so cold last March outside, and with a lot of frost and wild gales and rain, it really meant that nothing was flowering outside. But as well as the narcissi that I had in crates in the greenhouse, I also managed to grow muscari and hyacinths, and these flowered really well, and I was able to sell some to customers. And without these, I wouldn't have had any flowers to sell at all in March last year. So that was the greenhouse working really well for me. Amazingly, outside in March, I did have some anemones starting to flower, and these were absolutely beautiful. Just one or two, but was definitely a sign of things to come in the flower patch in the later months in the spring. At the very end of March last year, I was able to make some jam jar posies with some of the narcissi and hyacinths and muscari that I've been forcing in the greenhouse, and some tulips that I had forced in the greenhouse as well. So what I've learned from last year is that I want early flowers in March, then I really need to be growing under cover. So April arrived and the weather was really still very poor. It was still very, very cold outside and lots of frost, but I was starting to get my narcissi flowering, and I found that I had to net these as well last year because the pigeons were going for these as well. So netting really did help me to keep my flowers producing well and without petal damage. And I was able to pick some bunches of daffodils and narcissi for the garden gate stall and start to be able to make jam jar posies with a few more flowers from the garden. So flowers like anemones and fritillarias were coming out, as well as my narcissi and hyacinths. As well as the cold weather affecting the flowers coming out in the flower patch, I was also devastated to find that tulip fire had spread throughout my tulip beds. I had planted these out in late November, early December the previous autumn, hoping that that would be late enough to prevent tulip fire because the cold weather had set in. I had spaced them out well and I had used good quality bulbs, but despite that, tulip fire did spread throughout the beds and I lost the vast majority of my tulip crop last year. Thankfully, I had had weddings in April and I had planned ahead and decided that I would plant quite a lot of tulips in crates last year so that I could bring them inside or outside, depending on the weather, to bring them on for blooming at the time of the weddings. I am so glad that previous autumn that I had decided to plant some of my tulips into crates for those weddings. It did mean that I had the flowers that I needed in bloom then for them, and it also meant that my entire crop wasn't ruined and I did have some to sell. So from that I've really learned that I will always plant my tulips into different areas within my flower patches just in case something devastating does happen. You never know whether pests or diseases or animals in the garden will affect your crop, and tulips are such an expensive purchase that you make that you really can't risk the loss of having the whole crop gone. Although I had lost most of my tulip crop and therefore my sales to local florists for wholesale buckets of tulips, I did have enough flowers in my greenhouse flowering and tulips in the crates to start the garden gate stall off again when COVID restrictions lifted. And it was lovely to be able to make jars of flowers up again. It's one of my favourite things to do, to use recycled jars that customers have given me and to be able to put lovely cut spring flowers in them. April finished off last year with weddings, and I was so pleased to be able to provide some beautiful wedding flowers from the crates of flowers that I had in my greenhouse and some of the low tunneled flowers that I had out in the flower patch. Planning is definitely the key here to make sure that you are growing your flowers in lots of different places in the spring to cover all eventualities between disease, pests and weather. And I have definitely learned this year that the same thing applies, that I need to be putting some of my flowers into crates, some out under low tunnels in the garden and fleece, and some out just naturally in their beds with no cover. And that just covers me for whatever weather that I will have. So May last year, and I had been experimenting. I had been trying to sow sweet peas in the greenhouse to see if I could get them flowering earlier than the ones in the garden, and was this a worthwhile project? So yes, right at the start of May I had sweet peas, which is the earliest I have ever had sweet peas. However, the volume that I was able to grow in the greenhouse wasn't large and the stem length wasn't that great either, and it was only about 4 weeks later that I started to get them cropping outside in the garden. So I've decided that after that experiment I won't grow sweet peas in the greenhouse this year, because it is just worth waiting those extra couple of weeks to get the longer stemmed, much larger volume of sweet peas I would get outside. In May, I did have a lot of different flowers this year, which was fantastic. It's something that I've been working on for the last several years to plug the May gap. And normally I would have a lot of tulips at this time of year, especially early in May, but because I've had the problems with the tulip fire, I didn't have that volume that I normally would have. But I had an awful lot of other flowers that were coming through, things such as perennial cornflowers, bluebells, hesperus, honesty. I had some late narcissi from the pheasant's eye, and this was all helping me to be able to produce my first bouquets of the season. The key to managing May flowers is to make sure that you have lots of late flowering tulips and narcissi. So at the beginning of May you will have plenty of these late spring flowers still going. And to make sure that you plant enough perennials that you can use as cut flowers, which include things like Jacob's Ladder and Aquilegia, and then have some biennials, so things like Sweet William and Stalks and Hesperus and Honesty. All these kind of flowers can also really help at this time of year. And a good supply of alliums, bulbs that you plant in the autumn, are also excellent for providing some flowers in May. And I did provide a video back last year called The May Flower Gap, and that is worth a look at if you would like some more ideas about how to have lots of cut flowers for this particular month. The colours in May are very beautiful, lots of pinks and blues and whites and purples, and I'm trying this year to grow a few more perennials in the garden. I'll be splitting up and moving some around so that I can create more volume of flowers from the ones that I have. I have also planted more irises in the garden, and I have planted tulips in shadier patches of the garden as well to see if they will bloom later. So those late flowering varieties have been put in areas not in direct sunlight, and we'll see if that makes a difference and whether they will flower later in May for me. I also planted a huge number more of pheasant's eye narcissi this year because I did have a few in the garden last year, but every year I feel like I don't have enough of them. So I did put in a lot in the autumn, and we'll see if those flower well for me this year. After a difficult spring, it was really nice to have the June flowers come along. I was really pleased to start getting the sweet peas at the beginning of June outside, and one of the things that worked really well was the biodegradable jute netting that I used last year. I was really pleased with that. It was much better than the plastic netting I had been using before, and I've even managed to save it, and I think I should be able to reuse it. You can compost it after one use, but I think it was in good enough shape that I should be able to use it again this year, so I've stored it away in a box to get it out in the springtime. And so early on in June, just getting 1 or 2 sweet peas, but by the end of June, I had all these sweet peas, and I was able to cut loads for the garden gate stall, which was fantastic. By June, there were so many beautiful flowers that I could put in the garden gate stall. I had enough flowers that I could provide for florists. I had enough flowers for weddings. So although a slow start in the spring, the garden was really making up for it by June. Last year I planted a lot more iris than I normally would, and I was delighted with these. They flowered really, really well. The only thing that I would say about the iris is that they all came out at once, so I had a huge number of stems that I could provide, but it was over a very short time period. I planted some more iris this year, and they're in a few different places in the flower patch, so that might mean the difference between light and shade, and they might come out at slightly different times. Last year was the best year I'd ever had for growing ranunculus and anemones. They were just absolutely stunning, and I also had them over a really large number of weeks. So I had some flowering back in March, just a few because of the cold weather. Then we had them throughout May, and then in June the weather really still wasn't that hot, so the ranunculus were just keeping going and were stunning. Last June, I really loved making bouquets. I felt like the garden was really coming into its own. I felt like I had a lot of lovely perennials flowering, such as my Jacob's Ladder, my Aquilegia, and my Ranunculus Floripleno. I had annuals starting to come through, like my Orlea. I had Lady's Mantle to add a little bit of freshness to the arrangements. I had Phacelia, one of my favourite annuals, coming out. I had these gorgeous ranunculus that I could include in bouquets, and it was really a lot of fun making them. When you get to June, you no longer have the tulips and narcissi that you did have flowering in April and May, so you're now relying on a different type of flower. At this time of year, you do have your annuals starting to come through in Scotland, but the weather can still be quite cool, and it's towards the end of June that you'll start to get an abundance of your annuals coming through. You will have some sweet peas, but again, it does take a couple of weeks for them to get into full flow. So you do need your backup of things like alliums and perennials, such as your astrantia and your feverfew, your erinagium, your Jacob's Ladder, your Aquilegia, all these types of flowers to keep you going until the annuals fully kick in. I love June flowers as well because you can start to get all sorts of different colours. So in May you've had lots of blues and pinks and purples, but then in June you can also get reds and oranges and yellows, much brighter colours as well. So you've got a big palette to work with according to different customers' needs, because some customers will want a nice bright bouquet or jar of flowers, and others will want more pastel colours. I love being able to provide buckets of flowers to customers or to florists, and June's really the first month that you can provide a good volume of buckets. If I'm lucky and get a good spring, I can provide lots of buckets of tulips and narcissi, but the volume of flowers is really increased by the end of June, and you can provide so many different beautiful flowers in a mixed bucket to your local retail customers. I'm hoping that I will be able to provide a lot more buckets of flowers to florists in the future. I'm going to be doing another year of growing and arranging for wedding flowers, and then after this I'm going to be taking a break from the weddings, and I'm going to be concentrating more on providing flowers for local florists and also buckets of flowers to retail customers. So June for me is when you get the reward for all that hard work with your seed sowing. So you might have sown seeds back in the autumn, or you might have sown them in the late winter, early spring. And in June you'll start to see all these annuals flowering. And they flower fantastically for me. Hardy annuals like Scottish weather, and they like the soil in my garden, and they do really well. The one thing that I have to learn and take from last year again as well is succession sowing, because I had all these beautiful nigella sown and flowering for me in early summer, and then I didn't get so many later on because I didn't sow again. It tends to get busy May, June, and you tend to forget about needing to sow more for autumn flowers, but that's what I need to remember for this year. Cornflowers did really well for me again. They're a mainstay of wedding work because they do so well out of water, and I use them a lot in buttonholes. But last year I didn't have quite such a volume of cornflowers as I normally do, so I need to make sure that I grow a few more this year. In the last 2 years, what I found works really well with alliums is growing different varieties. Before I would just grow Purple Sensation and they would flower all at once, and that would be the alliums done for the year. But if you grow a lot of different varieties of alliums, you can actually have them flowering through May and June into July, which is fantastic because they're such a good structural flower. So June's always going to be a month that I'm going to remember after a really hard spring. It was so nice to be able to arrange with lots of lovely flowers from the garden again. And here's a few of my favourite pictures from June last year. It's going to be hopefully another great year for ranunculus and anemones this year, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the garden will bring at that time. July is maybe my favourite of the flower season months. The weather is normally very good, and it's also when you've got an abundance of flowers in the garden. So if a florist wants to come along and have a mixed bucket of flowers, then I can cut them easily from the garden. Or a last minute wedding, I can provide the bride with a bouquet of flowers, and I can provide the garden gate stall with an abundance of jam jar posies the whole month. And I can also provide for any bouquets that local customers might like. And the annuals are really doing well by this time. Last year, the snapdragons and Orlea were particularly fantastic. Larkspur did really well for me again. The larkspur is a difficult one to germinate. Once it's germinated, it's absolutely fine, and we'll do a video on this later this year. But I just didn't have that many plants, so I need to really see if I can manage to get more to germinate and bring on some more seedlings, and then get these planted out at different times in the flower season. So just keep on sowing those seeds and trying to get them through. Daucus was really good for me again last year. That's a really reliable flowering plant for me in the garden. The larkspur and the snapdragons in the garden are really good for providing spikes and bouquets, and I think that's what I need more of. I've got quite a lot of fillers that come from the Amimagus and the Daucus and the feverfew, but spikes is what I need. The cornflowers were good last year. Again, they didn't really come into a bulk volume like they normally do. The ones that we had were really nice, but I just don't think that I planted as many of them as I needed. The most important thing that you have to do in your flower patch is make sure that early on in the season, so in May, when these are just smaller plants, that you have to have your horizontal netting on, because by this stage in July the flowers and the plants are too tall to be able to net them securely. You could put twine and stakes round about to keep them upright, but you really do need the horizontal netting through it to provide complete support. Last year, my Buplerium really did excellently. It was a fantastic filler in bouquets, and this year I want to grow a lot more of it. Again, it can be quite a tricky one to get to germinate, but once you've got the seedling plants, it's very easy to look after, and as long as you net it horizontally to provide support, then it needs very little looking after. Last year I was really pleased with the cosmos. It provided an abundance of flowers right up until the first frosts in late October. But last year I decided to plant a lot of the double varieties, and for some reason I hadn't planted any of the Cosmos Purity, the white variety that I normally use a lot of. And this was a big mistake because I really regretted that later on and would have used it in wedding flowers and in bouquets. So this year I must make sure that I plant a lot more of the plainer white Purity variety and not so many of the frilly doubles. Feverfew has been a massive success for me in the garden. It grows really well and is an absolutely fantastic filler flower. And so many brides like having small daisy-like flowers in their bouquets, and it will flower for months for me. And it takes up quite a lot of space in the garden, so by incorporating it into my main flower borders, that has also helped. A few years ago I had beds full of yarrow and it was a fantastic filler flower. Last year I just didn't have so much at all, and so I've concentrated last autumn on sowing a lot more seeds of this, so hopefully in the next couple of years I'll get a good bed of yarrow back again, because it does make a great filler for bouquets. Last year I grew the most sunflowers that I've ever grown, and they were a huge success. I grew pro-cut varieties and I grew teddy bear varieties, and they just came out brilliantly. They were on strong stems, the petals were undamaged, and they sold really well and made some really bright bouquets and jar posies. The aim this year is to grow a lot more sunflowers as well. The only thing I'm hoping is that they don't all bloom in the 2 weeks I'm away on my summer holidays next year. So we'll have to see if we can kind of plan around that. Another massive success last year were the helichrysum. I was really surprised how well these did. I've always grown them, but not quite in the volume that I did this year. And they just kept going and going all the way through to the frost, producing masses of flowers, which was fantastic. I used so many of the helichrysum in my flower arranging that I didn't actually dry any last year, which is something that I'd like to try this year if I can grow as many again. So here I am looking at the dahlias and putting pots on the canes for the earwigs in the dahlia patch. They were just starting to flower in July last year. And the dahlias, they were very nice, the ones that I produced last year, but the volume just wasn't there. I don't know what happened last year to mean that there weren't as many dahlia flowers as normal, because I had a lot of plants, and I don't think I did anything differently last year. But the aim for this year is to move them to a different location in a different flower patch and see if they do any better there for me. July last year was just full of wedding flowers, and absolutely fantastic to be a part of these couples' special days, especially as they'd had to wait for so long, cancelling and rescheduling their weddings because of the coronavirus over the last couple of years. And last summer we were able to do all the weddings that were planned, and they all went ahead, which was absolutely fantastic. And July is a really nice time to do wedding flowers if you are a flower farmer, because there's just an abundance of different varieties of flowers to grow in the garden and to cut from. And there's nothing nicer than being able to go out into the garden and to cut some special flowers that go straight into a bride's bouquet. As well as all the weddings in July, there's also lots of bouquet orders for local customers, and I keep the garden gate stall fully stocked up with lots of lovely jars of flowers throughout the summer weeks. And it's lovely to be able to cut some fresh sweet peas, or to fill a jar with cornflowers and the first dahlias. And the scent and the variety of flowers is amazing that you can get out of the garden. And it's just nice walking up to the garden gate stall and just having that scent hit you, and seeing all the bees that are flying in to the stall as well to gather their nectar. There's lots of bouquet orders at this time too, and it's really nice to make a different bouquet for everybody that gets one, so they're never the same. You'll never pick the same flowers any day in a row, you'll always choose a different combination. So anybody getting a bouquet locally, it will be quite different. July last year kept me really busy with orders for buckets of flowers as well. And July, just like June, is a good month for providing buckets of flowers, because there's just an abundance of different ones in the garden that you can use for local florists or retail customers. July last year I'll remember for the sunflowers and for these really cheerful bouquets and jars that we were able to provide. So lots more sunflowers on the menu for this year. August, we were away on holiday for the first couple of weeks in August, and this is always making it a tricky month, because you're self-employed, you're not earning any income when you're away, and you're also having flowers sitting in your flower patch that don't have homes. So sometimes it's really nice if you can have a florist that can come in and cut some flowers from the garden, and hopefully something that they really enjoy while you're away. And this happened this year, and I had a lovely florist from Edinburgh come in and choose some of her own flowers, which was great. Once you've been away on holiday, you never quite know what you're coming back to. And this year I had a really nice surprise because I came back to zinnias in the greenhouse. And these are flowers that I tried a few years ago to grow here in Scotland. And I grew them outside and they never came to much. There just wasn't enough heat in our Scottish weather to provide good zinnias. But this year I thought I'll have another shot, and I just brought one variety and started it off in the greenhouse in pots. And when I come back from my holidays, they were flowering and they kept going through the whole of August and September, and were a really great surprise for me. So they are definitely the flower of the year, and that's made me confident to try them again this year. I definitely wouldn't try them outside where I live, but I have brought a few more varieties from the seed catalogues this year, and I'm going to try them again in pots and see if we can get 2 years running of these great flowers. Coming back from holiday, it was really nice to fill the stall with flowers again and to work on some late summer weddings. And I really liked being able to use some natural plant dyed silk ribbon to arrange my wedding flowers. Usually I wrap my bouquets in twine, which is really nice and gives it a nice rustic look. But actually using the silk ribbon I found really nice and worked really well with the flowers, and it was great matching colours up to the different flowers in the bouquets. September flowers are beautiful, but they do require a little bit more protection, especially if you're doing weddings. You can get early morning dews, you can get frosts, you can get rain and wind, which can damage the petals and the flowers. This September I was really lucky. The weather was on my side and we didn't get any early frosts like the year before. So I was able to keep bouquets going for a longer period of time, manage my September weddings. And some of the flowers that were looking really good this month that I'm going to try growing again are Rudbeckia. They were really nice. I got some cherry brandy ones especially, which were a really nice colour. The scabious were fantastic. They just kept producing flowers. Cosmos were very good at this time of year. The dahlias were nice, but again low volumes, and we did have problems with some thrips, especially on the white ones outside. Chrysanthemums I found were really nice. I was growing them in the greenhouse this year because I had tried them outside in the garden and they had been absolutely fine until the weather changed. And because the weather the year before had changed early, I thought this year I better just grow them inside. And I think that was a mistake because they were really affected by aphids. And I think if I'd grown them outside, I wouldn't have had this problem. So the plan for chrysanthemums this year is to grow them outside in the flower patches and just to grow the earlier flowering varieties. I had tried the late flowering varieties outside before, but my flower season just finishes too early for that. And if I'm not going to grow any under glass because of the aphids, then I don't need to be planting late flowering varieties. October is either a hit or a miss for flowers because we don't know whether we're going to have frosts or not. In 2021, the frost stayed away until November, which was really late for us, the latest I've ever known in the flower patch. And the flowers just kept on coming, which was brilliant. The Rudbeckia were great, the snapdragons, the helichrysum, the scabious, the cosmos, the flowers just kept on coming. So it was important to have sown the seedlings for those back in April time, so you get those late summer flowers at that back end of the year. One of the flowers that I am going to try and improve my growing of is going to be the dahlias this year. I'm going to try and get some blush pink ones if I can, because that is what's missing from my collection. Helichrysum, I'm going to try growing some of those in more pastel shades as well, because I've got a lot of very bright colours of those. And Rudbeckia as well. I'd quite like to try some different colours than the very bright orange and the cherry brandy red. So I'm going to look and see if I can get some Sahara seeds for that as well. Looking back at the pictures of my flowers from last year really helps me to plan for what to grow this season. I can see what grew well, I can see what I maybe didn't have enough of, or things that didn't work out well. And so I definitely recommend taking lots of photographs throughout the year of your flowers and of your gardens, and that'll help you with your planning the next year. And also keeping a garden journal can be really helpful as well, just jotting a few things down every day or every week, and that will help remind you from year to year about the weather, the seasons, and what grew well for you. I hope you enjoyed having a look at all those nice flowery pictures there. I always like looking back through them because it just reminds me of all the beautiful flowers that I was able to grow last year, and it gets me excited again thinking about what's to come in the next few months. And there's always going to be new things that I'm going to try, but there's the old favourites that I now know that have to go on my shopping list for seeds that are going to be the main staples of what I grow in my flower patch this year.